Disclaimer. This video's information is being provided for informational, educational, and general interest purposes only. The information in this video is not intended to shock, enrage, or otherwise provoke the viewer. The sole purpose of this video was to raise awareness of true crime-related events. Copyright disclaimer: under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Non-profit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
Father Jerome Kern was deposed under oath on April 15, 2014, in connection with a lawsuit he filed in Minnesota in November 2013 alleging sexual abuse. The public was able to view the deposition video and the documents from Kern's file on June 24, 2014. In spite of reports of inappropriate behavior with children dating back to 1969, documents reveal how officials failed to stop Kern from abusing more children during his more than 30-year tenure as a priest in the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis. Kern admits to sexually abusing children during this time. Father Jerome Kern was ordained on December 17, 1966, and he worked in parishes all over Minnesota for his whole career. Reports of Kern's inappropriate sexual behavior with minors were brought to the attention of the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis as early as 1969. However, Kern continued to serve in the ministry until 2002. The first reports of abuse appeared in 1969 at St. Mark's in St. Paul, Minnesota, where Father Kern was employed. After that, Kern was moved to Our Lady of Grace in Edina, Minnesota, where he kept abusing children sexually. After being moved to Immaculate Heart of Mary in 1973, Kern assaulted survivor Al Michaud sexually. One of the victims of Kern's sexual abuse wrote a letter to then Archbishop Roach at the beginning of the 1980s, but Roach never answered. The mothers of two boys who had been abused at St. Mark's met with Bishop Robert Carlson and Father Michael O'Connell around 1987, at which point they disclosed that Kern had sexually abused their sons. Carlson and O'Connell thought that Kern was the one who did these things. When Father Ronaldo Carlson, Kern's co-pastor at Immaculate Heart of Mary, met with Father O'Connell that same year, he informed him that Kern had a habit of bringing boys between the ages of 6 and 11 onto his lap and tickling them. The two survivors, along with their mothers, received an apology letter from Kern. When survivor Al Michaud met with then Vice-Secretary General Kevin McDonough in 1992 to 1993, he disclosed that Kern had been sexually abused at Immaculate Heart of Mary as a young child. After reviewing Kern's file, McDonough warned Michaud that he would become enraged and start crying in public. When Michaud called McDonough 2 weeks later to find out what had been done regarding Kern, McDonough informed him he didn't have time to handle it. After that, Michaud sued Kern in the Archdiocese. The case was eventually settled. Kern acknowledged placing his hands on one victim's stomach, chest, lower abdomen, and inside his bathing suit while the victim was swimming during a 1994 deposition. Additionally, Kern acknowledged that while in the sauna, he touched Al Michaud's stomach and chest in addition to touching his genitalia outside of his swimsuit. The Archdiocese informed Michaud that Kern would not work in a different parish or with children as part of the settlement. Father Jerome Kern's 1995 assignment and work location are unknown, but in 1996 he was assigned to St. Peter's in Forest Lake, Minnesota, which has a religious education program and a grade school. As of November 2013, Father Kern is thought to be living in St. Paul, Minnesota.
911, what's your emergency?
This is a chronology of Father Jerome Kern's events. To preserve their anonymity, the victims' names have been redacted. On December 17, 1966, Jerome Kern was ordained. On September 17, 1966, Jerome Kern became an assistant pastor. In 1969, Jerome Kern sexually abused an 11-year-old boy. In 1969, Jerome Kern sexually abused two boys on a swimming outing at Lake Nokomis. On September 13, 1969, the mother of a Jerome Kern survivor writes to Monsignor Gilligan discussing her son's abuse by Jerome Kern and expressing concern for other children. Later, a copy is mailed to the Archbishop. In late 1969, parents of John Doe's 2 and 3 reported abuse of sons to Monsignor Gilligan, pastor at St. Mark's. In late 1969, Monsignor Gilligan reported Jerome Kern's abuse of the children to Archbishop Byrne. Archbishop Byrne told Father William Kenny about the report. In 1969, parents of John Doe's 2 and 3 reported Father Jerome Kern's inappropriate sexual conduct with their minor sons to the Archbishop. Jerome Kern met with the families and explained that what he was doing was Italian wrestling, something he saw in Italy where men wrestled and grabbed one another's genitals. Parents wrote letters to Archdiocese. In late 1969, Father William Kenny met with Father Joe Baglio, pastor, and Father Richard Jube, associate pastor at Our Lady of Grace in Edina, about Jerome Kern and Richard Jube switching assignments. On December 17, 1969, Jerome Kern transferred to Our Lady of Grace in Edina. On January 2, 1970, Jerome Kern became assistant pastor at Our Lady of Grace in Edina. In 1969 to 1970, Jerome Kern sexually abused John Doe 4. In 1970s, Jerome Kern likely sexually abused John Doe 5. In 1971, Jerome Kern sexually abused John Doe 6 and John Doe 7. In 1972, Jerome Kern sexually abused John Doe 8. In 1971 to 1976, Jerome Kern sexually abused John Doe 9. In 1972 to 1976, Jerome Kern sexually abused John Doe 26 when he was 12 to 16 years old. In 1972, Jerome Kern sexually abused John Doe 10. In 1973, Jerome Kern sexually abused John Doe 11 when he was 11 years old and sexually abused John Doe 12. In 1973 to 1974, Jerome Kern sexually abused John Doe 13. On March 21, 1975, Jerome Kern became an administrator at Our Lady of Grace in Edina. On June 1, 1976, Jerome Kern was assigned to Immaculate Heart of Mary in Minnetonka. On June 15, 1976, Jerome Kern became co-pastor at Immaculate Heart of Mary in Minnetonka. In mid-1970s, Jerome Kern sexually abused John Doe 14. In 1977, Jerome Kern sexually abused John Doe 15 when he was 15 years old. In 1977 to 1978, Jerome Kern sexually abused John Doe 16 when he was 11 or 12 years old. In 1977 or 1978, Jerome Kern sexually abused John Doe 17. In 1979, Jerome Kern sexually abused John Doe 18. In 1981 or 1982, Jerome Kern sexually abused John Doe 19. In 1980s, John Doe 26 wrote a letter to Archbishop Roach reporting that he was sexually abused by Jerome Kern as a child. Archbishop Roach did not respond. On June 1, 1987, victims 2 and 3 and their mothers met with Archdiocesan officials, Father Michael O'Connell and Bishop Robert Carlson. Both survivors reported that Jerome Kern had touched their genitals when they were children. Michael O'Connell met with Jerome Kern. Jerome Kern admitted his actions were totally inappropriate. On June 17, 1987, Jerome Kern sent to servants of the Paraclete in New Mexico. Michael O'Connell sent a letter to Paracletes noting the John Doe's 2 and 3 abuse and also noting that Michael O'Connell had seen Jerome Kern at the gym at the seminary with young boys. On November 6, 1987, Father Michael O'Connell met with Father Ronaldo Custodio. Father Custodio was co-pastor with Jerome Kern at Immaculate Heart of Mary. Father Ronaldo Custodio reported that Jerome Kern had a habit of pulling 6 to 11-year-old boys onto his lap and tickling them, and would only do this to boys. On November 30, 1987, Archdiocese sent Jerome Kern to Dr. Gary Schoner for a reassessment. Michael O'Connell sent Dr. Gary Schoner a letter with the Paraclete report and a recitation of the John Doe's and 2 and 3 abuse, Michael O'Connell's observation of Jerome Kern with a young boy at the seminary, and Father Ronaldo Custodio's observations of Jerome Kern's habit of pulling young boys onto his lap. On January 7, 1988, Michael O'Connell notes of his conversation with Dr. Gary Schoner. Dr. Gary Schoner finds that Jerome Kern had no impulse control problem and the abuse 18 years earlier was really roughhousing. On March 28, 1988, Jerome Kern wrote an apology letter to John Does 2 and 3 and their mothers. On April 13, 1988, Michael O'Connell wrote to the families of John Does 2 and 3 discussing his response to their allegations against Jerome Kern and enclosing Jerome Kern's apology letter. It states that Jerome Kern is not a danger to young people today. On April 26, 1988, Michael O'Connell memo to Archbishop Roach stating that Schoner found that there is no current danger in assigning Jerome Kern to a parish. On December 7, 1990, Michael O'Connell memo to file discussing an incident where Jerome Kern took his pants off in front of a boy in a group setting some years earlier. In May of 1992, Jerome Kern told Father Kevin McDunn that John Doe 6 had accused Jerome Kern of sexually abusing him as a child. On January 11, 1993, Al Michaud met with Father Kevin McDunn and reported that Jerome Kern sexually abused him as a child. On January 22, 1993, Father Kevin McDunn letter to Dr. Gary Schoner discussing Al Michaud's report of abuse, stating that he is disturbed by how similar Al Michaud's account is to the abuse of John Does 2 and 3. In 1993, Al Michaud filed a lawsuit against Jerome Kern and the Archdiocese. On September 9, 1993, Archbishop Roach letter, drafted by Father Kevin McDunn, to parishioners at Immaculate Heart of Mary informing them that a lawsuit had been filed that alleges abuse in the swimming pool, but Jerome Kern denies it. There were 70 others in the pool, the plaintiff wasn't a parishioner, and the plaintiff had no prior relationship with Jerome Kern. In 1993, Archbishop Roach went to Immaculate Heart of Mary and proclaimed that Al Michaud was lying. On October 18, 1993, Al Michaud wrote his own letter to parishioners at Immaculate Heart of Mary telling them his version and that there were prior allegations of the same nature in 1969. In 1993 to 1995, Jerome Kern allowed to live at St. Paul's Seminary and go on sabbatical, allowed to go to South America. In 1994, Jerome Kern's deposition taken. Jerome Kern admitted that while swimming he put his hand on victim 2's chest, stomach, lower stomach, and inside his swimsuit. Jerome Kern also admitted that he touched Al Michaud's genitals on the outside of Al Michaud's swimsuit and that he touched his chest and stomach in the sauna. April 12, 1994, memo from Father Kevin McDunn to Father Jaruzelski summarizing options for Jerome Kern's ministry: 1. Temporary administrator for a few months, 2. Senior associate, or 3. 6-month sabbatical. Archdiocese would pay his costs and salary if he went on sabbatical. In 1994 to 1995, the Archdiocese settled Al Michaud's lawsuit and promised Al Michaud that Jerome Kern would not be in another parish or around children. On January 17, 1995, memo from Archbishop Roach to Father Kevin McDunn recommending Jerome Kern be placed in a parish setting. I don't think he is going to really heal until he has some good experience in a parish. Kevin McDunn's notes say to get Jerome Kern into a temporary associate position. On January 31, 1995, memo from Bill Fallon to the Clergy Review Board summarizing the allegations against Jerome Kern's response, and the Archdiocese's responses to the allegations. On March 9, 1995, Jerome Kern was assigned to St. Dominic in Northfield. On March 18, 1995, Jerome Kern became a temporary administrator at St. Dominic in Northfield. On June 7, 1995, Jerome Kern was assigned to St. Peter's Forest Lake in Minnesota. In addition, St. Peter's operated a grade school. On June 15, 1995, according to the recommendations made by the Clergy Review Board, Jerome Kern needs to have his condition assessed and receive required therapy. The results of earlier evaluations were unclear. On June 17, 1995, at the Church of St. Peter in Forest Lake, Jerome Kern was appointed parochial vicar. On June 27, 1995, an overview of Father Kevin McDun's discussion about the accusations against Jerome Kern at St. Peter in Forest Lake. Notes: the meeting began with suspicions, but it quickly turned positive after Father Kevin McDunn clarified to the participants that Jerome Kern was a capable pastor who unfortunately has a mostly unmerited taint on his record rather than a known child abuser. On January 9, 1996, Father Kevin McDunn writes to St. John Vianney's staff about Jerome Kern coming for an evaluation in October 1996. In October of 1996, Jerome Kern went to St. John Vianney for an evaluation. February 28, 2002, Father Kevin McDonough informed Jerome Kern that he believed Jerome Kern would come under attack if continued in a parish because of the past allegations. Jerome Kern submitted his resignation.
Right hand, please. You do swear the testimony you're about to give relative to the cause and honor consideration shall be the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Okay, proceed.
Father, would you please state your full name for the record?
Kevin Michael, both standard spelling, McDonough, M-C capital D, O-N-O-U-G-H.
You've been through this process before. You know you're under oath, and it's being recorded both by videotape and transcription.
I do know that.
Okay. Father, has any law enforcement agency, police agency, interviewed you or attempted to interview concerning your role in the handling of priests in the Archdiocese at any time to this day?
Now, you're not required to reveal any information you learned from your lawyers when you answer his question.
Yeah. I have over a number of the last 20 or more years spoken with law enforcement officials regularly, so yes, in various occasions I've spoken with law enforcement about one or another clergy-related matter.
My question to you is, has any law enforcement agency recently contacted you and attempted to interview concerning their investigation of you and other archdiocesan officials in your and their role in the handling of clergy sex abuse?
I don't know the nature of their inquiry, but not long ago, perhaps before Christmas, I don't recall exactly, two St. Paul police officers reached out, left a letter for me because I wasn't absent. I wasn't present. I was saying Mass at the time. I turned the letter over to my attorney and asked my attorney to...
Don't tell them what you told me.
Did you talk to the law enforcement officers that sought to speak to you?
I did not.
Did you refuse?
I did not.
Was that Sergeants Urbanski and Skoog
I don't remember their names.
from St. Paul Police Department?
There were people from St. Paul Police, that's right. I was not there when they came, so don't know who they were.
What reason was given to law enforcement as to why you chose not to speak to them?
Don't tell anything that you and I talked about.
No. But what reason was given to them?
I don't know.
Why didn't you speak to them?
Don't answer that.
I asked...
Don't answer the question. It calls for privilege.
Did you read the letter?
I don't recall whether I read the letter or not.
The letter was sent to you by them, was it not?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And it said, Father McDonough, we want to speak to you concerning our investigation of your role and others in an ongoing investigation concerning the role of you and other archdiocesan officials in this investigation, correct?
I don't recall the content of the letter.
Okay. Did you give that letter to anybody else besides your lawyer, Mr. Burrell?
Don't answer the question because it assumes there was a communication between you and me.
Well, did you give that letter to anybody besides a lawyer for you?
I did not.
Did you give it to Archbishop Neinstadt?
Believe I did not.
Did you tell him the police were attempting to contact you and interview you?
Almost certain I did not.
Did you ever discuss with Archbishop Neinstadt the fact that the police were trying to interview you?
I believe I did not.
Never discussed that with him at any time?
I believe I did not.
Did you ever discuss that with the chancellor?
And which chancellor would that be?
That would be either Eisenzimmer or Keppers?
I may have told Kippers that I had received a letter.
And what did you tell him?
I believe I told him I'd received a letter.
And did you tell him that you intended not to discuss it with the police?
I don't believe I discussed the matter at any length with him.
What did Keppers say when you told him about the letter?
I don't recall what he said.
The police have reported in the newspapers that you had refused to cooperate with them. Is that correct?
Is what correct?
That you had refused to cooperate with law enforcement in their investigation?
Yeah, I can't speak to whether they've indicated this in the newspapers because I've not been reading the great majority of newspaper reports related to any of these matters in recent months.
Have you, when you say recent months, how many?
Since last fall.
Well, you talked to NPR before last fall, didn't you?
I did. Actually, I talked to them right at the very end of September.
And so why did you stop reading news accounts and make a decision not to follow what was going on?
I had other work I thought was more important and required my full attention.
And so do you agree or disagree with the characterization that you refused to cooperate with law enforcement in their ongoing and current investigation?
I disagree with that.
And how have you worked with them then recently in their investigation? What have you done?
There's been no further contact from St. Paul in recent months. So
what efforts have you made to cooperate with them?
there have been no further contact from them in recent months. So.
Have you ever reached out to them to provide them information?
No.
Why not?
That's, I don't see what would be appropriate about that.
You don't want them to know what you know?
One doesn't simply call the police and say, I'd like to come in for a chat, ladies and gentlemen.
If you have evidence of a crime and crimes being committed, either past or current, don't you think that's something they could and should know?
I'm imagining we'll have a chance to address a number of those things today.
Yeah, but don't you think that's also a matter for the police, not just us?
Well, I'm also imagining you'll have a chance to pass the information along to the police.
So is it your expectation that you would wait till this deposition and be required to sit for this deposition that the police would get the information?
You know, the police have been in a position to reach out to me insofar as they'd wanted to. I've had no reach out from them for multiple months.
But you chose not to talk to them, right?
That's correct.
So them reaching out to you isn't going to get them anywhere because you're not going to talk to them, right?
I'm not in their head. I can't tell you what their thinking is.
Well, if they come over here today at the end of this deposition and ask to talk to you, are you going to talk to them?
Do you want me to speculate about that sort of thing?
I'm going to ask you if you're going to tell them, if you're going to talk to them.
If I don't want to deal with the hypothetical. Deal with the police when they contact me.
Well, the police investigation is not hypothetical. You know it's ongoing, right?
I don't know that.
I'm telling you it is.
Okay.
Are you going to testify today?
And I don't think it's any secret to you that there's an ongoing investigation, is it?
I don't know the status of the police work.
Well, the letter to you said there was, correct?
I don't recall reading the letter at any length.
Is that the first time you ever have received a letter or a request from the police to interview you concerning your role in an ongoing investigation?
I've spoken with the police many times over my years in church leadership, but so I'm not sure. Perhaps you can help me understand You're underlining the word "your role." Could you help me understand what you're asking?
Your role as a top official in the Archdiocese and the cover-up of sexual abuse by priests.
I don't believe there's ever been a cover-up. So I don't recall ever being approached by the police with any allegation from them about a cover-up.
Well, then why do you think the police are investigating or chose to send you a letter to interview you concerning an investigation? Why do you think that is?
Sorry, I'm not their counselor, and nor am I in their mind.
Okay, Father, you've been a priest of the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis since your ordination in 1980, correct?
That's correct.
And served in many official capacities. And when I look at your history, it looks like there's about 4 years approximately where you weren't in some position appointed by the Archbishop in the Chancery. Is that about right?
Yes, so if I could just clarify, any position I was in, I was appointed by the Archbishop. So that's the first part of your question. But yes, since 1984, when I first was appointed, I've had various appointments through the Archdiocese.
Beginning as Vice Chancellor, then Chancellor, correct?
That's correct.
And then Vicar General, and you also referred to the position of Vicar General as kind of like a chief of staff.
That's correct.
I think when I asked you about that position earlier, I think you described that as kind of the implementer of the Archbishop's practices, and the Archbishop would be described as the legislator. Do you recall that descriptor?
I don't recall saying it to you, but the Archbishop is both the chief legislator and the chief implementer, the chief executive. But I was his chief executive officer, one might say.
And as Vicar General, you would be his delegate. You would be delegated to be his implementer?
That's a fair characterization.
Trying to use a neutral term.
Yes, the term delegation has a technical meaning in church law, but for today's conversation, let's proceed with it.
You're also a canonist, trained in canon law.
That's correct.
Worked as the archivist for a period of time as well?
I was chancellor, and one of the roles of the chancellor is to supervise the archives. I would not consider myself, however, an archivist, which is a technical skill which I'm not trained.
Basically, the role of chancellor gives you access to the archives, is really what it means, correct?
That's correct.
And you've then worked under Archbishops Roach, Flynn, and Neinstedt, correct?
That is correct.
All right. In 2008, you were appointed to be the delegate for safe environment by Archbishop Neinstedt, is that correct?
That's correct.
At the same time, it looks like you were promoted to be the promoter of justice. Is that correct?
No.
Tell me about when you were appointed to be promoter of justice.
Right. The term promoter of justice is something parallel in church law to a prosecutor in civil law, and one's appointed a promoter of justice for particular cases.
Okay. So that's designated on certain cases.
That's correct.
For example, in the Waymeyer case, you were appointed to be the promoter of justice by the Archbishop.
I don't recall that that's true. It could be, but I don't recall that that's true.
And as the prosecutor, at least in canon law, internal church protocol, the prosecutor is required to both to protect the rights of the priests as well as abide by the internal canon protocols, correct?
I'm not sure. I don't understand the question. Could you help me with that?
As a prosecutor, aren't you, and promoter of justice under canon law, aren't you required to make sure the priest is afforded the rights under canon law?
Yes.
Father McDonough, would you agree that the Archdiocese has a very grave responsibility to make sure the children in the Archdiocese are safe?
Absolutely.
Would you also agree that the Archdiocese, and in your own experience as a priest in it, has promised the people of the Archdiocese that the children in it are safe?
Insofar as I've been involved, we've promised that we would make our efforts to keep children safe. I've often said myself that, of course, parents have to remain attentive, and all people should remain attentive, since no one person can see that all children remain safe. But yes, I've promised personally my own best efforts as a pastor, for example.
Would you agree that the Archdiocese and its officials should not gamble and take known risks with the safety of the children?
All human activity, of course, includes some risk. The very to offer to educate children or otherwise be engaged in children involves some risk that public institutions of all sorts take. But I wouldn't, the word gamble is of course a loaded word, and one ought to take every reasonable precaution in the inherently sensitive work of educating, forming, promoting the good of children.
Would you agree that the Archdiocese should make every possible effort to protect children from sexual abuse?
Yes.
Is it correct to say that the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis has promised repeatedly that there are no offenders in ministry in the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis?
When you say offenders, could you help me understand that word?
Priests who have offended children.
Against minors, who've offended against minors. I believe that's true, yes. The Archdiocese has said that.
Thank you.
Father McDonough, would you agree that it is and always has been the stated policy of the Archdiocese to not allow offenders to work in public ministry?
No.
When did that become a policy, if it ever did?
It did become a policy as part of the Archdiocese's response to the Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People, so sometime in 2002.
Okay. And I'm going to show you what we've marked as Exhibit 101. It's way at the back.
Okay. So the numbers you're offering correspond to these numbers here?
Yes. And while you're retrieving that, just to contextualize it for you, I'm referring to a St. Paul Pioneer Press and Dispatch article of February 16th, 1987. And on the first page of it, the headline is "Cover-up of Priest Sex Misconduct Denied." And there's a picture of Robert Carlson, Father Robert Carlson. On the second page, I'll direct your attention to the second column in the top of it. And the second sentence, and I'll read it and ask you if you understood this to be correct. It states, Carlson said, quote, "Therefore, it's our current policy that a minister would never return to parish, because how can you separate working with adults and working with children, since families make up that parish community?" And it begins with, and I quote him, "It's our policy today that there really is no cure for someone with the disease of pedophilia, but only a chance for some recovery." Was that the policy as you understood it to be in 1987?
At the time this article was produced, February of 1987, I wasn't resident in the Archdiocese, but rather I was away at graduate school. So I was not part of these discussions, and frankly rather wrapped up in the work of completing my doctoral studies.
When you returned from studies in Rome in 1980, I think it was 87.
It was in 87, it was later that same year.
What did you understand the policy of the Archdiocese then to be?
Yeah. The best statement of it, I think, came in early 1988 when then Archbishop Roach published a statement on sexual abuse of minors. And I'm not recalling that in any great detail. That's probably available to you. It might be in the documentation, Mr. Anderson, you have here. But that would be the most thorough statement of it.
We have that somewhere, and I think, to paraphrase it, it in effect says that priests who have offended will not be returned to ministry. Does that sound?
Do you know, I don't think so. We might as well engage this.
Okay, well,
directly.
we'll look at the policy together
Right.
then,
Good.
when we have it. Let's look at Exhibit 102. And Exhibit 102, Father, is dated October 30th, 1998, and it states Church Updates Sex Abuse Policy. And at the second page, you were quoted in caps, and I'll read it and then ask you if this is what you said. It states, "Priests who molested children are not allowed to work in a parish setting or have any contact with children," McDonough said. First, did you say that?
Of course, I don't recall specifically. It was a long time ago, but I had no reason to think that they misquoted me in that regard.
And when you said that, did you believe that to be, in fact, the stated policy of the Archdiocese?
Again, not recalling specifically what I said, that would have been my understanding then. Yes.
When did you first have such an understanding?
I think it was clarified after the 1988 publication of the policy by Archbishop Roach.
So this fundamentally could have been a restatement of what you believe the policy to have been for many years, as written in '88.
Yes.
You did mention a policy change that came about in 2002 as a result of the Charter for Protection of Children. And how was the policy then changed in 2002 as a result of the Charter?
And may I ask you, because the charter, as I presume you know, is quite extensive, is there a specific part of it you'd like me to address?
Well, you said there was a change in policy in
Okay.
2002, and I was referring to what you were referring to.
All right, thank you. As in the period from 1988 until 2002, men who had committed crimes against young people were still retained in what we understood to be administrative capacities in the Archdiocese. And after 2002, that permitting, and were still allowed to practice as priests, for example, saying Mass to convents of sisters. And after 2002 and the change, that was no longer permitted.
And those were priests who had committed crimes against children, weren't they?
Right, committed crimes, or at least because there wasn't always a complete determination of the criminal status of their activity, given how old some of the complaints were, committed actions that reasonable people would think were crimes. I don't want to convict someone who didn't have a judge or jury to do so, but.
So do you believe that a
it
judge or jury has to convict a priest before you can deem him to be a danger to the public?
No.
In this same exhibit 102, at the second page of it, in the second to the last column in the bottom paragraph, there's a quote from you, and I'll read it, then ask you a question, Father. It states, in quotes, in a case when an individual appears to have faced the underlying casualties, is generally sorry, where the victims are comfortable with this, and where there is disclosure, then we will put a person with specific skills back to work, unquote, said McDonough. That is a lot of hoops to go through. You're talking here to the public about disclosure. What was and is, at that time, the policy of the Archdiocese pertaining to disclosure of clerics who have been accused of sexual abuse of minors, who are still in ministry?
You know, I'm going to object to your question or ask you to clarify, because you said was and is, and I'm not sure that he understands what your time frame is.
Well, did you understand the question?
Well, actually, I do want to point out a couple of things in your question. One is the word, I think, is causalities rather than casualties.
Okay.
But the other is, as you notice from the preceding paragraph, that all of this material refers to priests who exploited adults.
Okay.
So that's that portion of the, so I'm not sure that the last sentence you asked me about connects to the material here.
Okay, well, let's do this. Let's talk about disclosure, and let's talk about minor, and let's talk about priests accused of abusing minors. And the policy as it existed in 1998, at the time of this article. What was the policy of disclosure concerning what the Archdiocese knew about priests who had been accused of abuse of minors, concerning priests who were in ministry at that time?
Good. Throughout the 1990s, the practice, or at least after 1992 for certain, perhaps even before that, may I mention 1992, is when the 1988 specific policy on sexual abuse of minors was then further embedded in a broader set of policies we refer to commonly as sexual issues in ministry policies. Throughout the 1990s, the practice was if a priest were working in a ministry setting of any sort, and as I say in the 90s, that would have been, if we knew he was such a man, he were working in an administrative capacity, or even providing pastoral care on some stable basis, for example, saying masses for sisters, that we would tell for certain the leadership involved in the local setting, and often others, not always, but often others, that this man had this history.
You said that was the practice that was begun to be employed in 1992. Is that the word you used, practice?
Yes.
Was that a policy?
The sexual issues in ministry document that we published in 1992, which we can spend time on it if you'd like to do that, is largely a listing, a public listing to the whole world of what our expected practices would be. I've never particularly liked the word policy because it's a confusing word somewhere between law, which bishops can give. We talked earlier already today about the bishop as a legislator, and administrative practice. So policy is difficult to say sometimes what the intention is between law and practice. So this set of statements is about practice.
Well, Archbishop Neinstadt commissioned some new folks, another commission headed by Reverend Witt, to develop some new policies. As you know, were announced, I think, yesterday, right?
Once again, I have not looked carefully. I believe, however, my friends have said there was some sort of announcement on Monday, so it's probably 2 days ago.
All right, 2 days ago. Did you decline or refuse to speak to Father Witt and those doing the investigation, the internal investigation of the Archdiocese? Yes or no?
Yes, I did say that I was not interested in that time being interviewed. I don't believe it was an internal investigation, but rather an inventory of the practices.
Well, it was an investigation being done by the Archbishop, reported publicly to be headed by Father Witt. You're aware of that?
Well, actually, I don't know what the term investigation means here, so I'm not going to agree with you, Mr. Anderson.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you knew that the Archbishop had impaneled some folks to look at the policies and practices in the Archdiocese, correct?
Yes.
And when they contacted you, who contacted you?
Well, be sure that you don't answer the question by talking about anything you and I discussed.
These are archdiocesan officials. Who contacted you from the Archdiocese?
I don't believe any archdiocesan official contacted me.
Well, who contacted you that conducted this?
I believe one or another of the volunteers on the committee
Who was it?
contacted me. I don't recall.
When was it?
Sometime last fall.
What month?
I don't recall.
You indicated that you basically stopped reading about this in September sometime.
I believe in October.
Okay, so when the contact then was in October? Or,
But I don't know when the contact was.
and you don't know who it was that contacted you
That's correct.
to get the information that you had or didn't have concerning what they wanted to know about?
That's correct. Well, I don't know. They said, will you come and talk with us? And I said, not now.
And why did you refuse to cooperate with them and talk with them and give them the information?
From the very beginning, I felt that there was a media frenzy about all of this. Some of it stirred up by inaccurate statements from yourself. And so I decided very early on that it would be better that folks who were doing whatever studies they were doing would proceed. And at some point, I'd have an opportunity to offer my input. Since most of my activity heavily documented publicly for many, many years, I didn't see any particular pressing need to defend my record.
Well, you knew this was something that was being done by the Archbishop, not by me, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So it had nothing to do with me, did it?
The media frenzy had a good deal to do with you.
Well, that may be, but the investigation that the Archbishop was doing was one you knew to have been empowered by him, correct?
Yes.
And you also knew that you were under an obligation of obedience to him at that time and all times, correct?
That's correct.
And you also knew that the person that contacted you in the fall to get information from you was his delegated representative to conduct this investigation, correct?
No.
What did
So
you
let's back up.
understand it? What did you understand it to be then?
I've already disputed the characterization of this as an investigation.
Well, let's call it an audit then.
Yes. All right. All right.
You want to call it an audit?
I call it a study.
Okay,
All
let's
right.
call it a study.
Call it a study.
Okay,
Yes.
they were studying the problem, right?
Right.
And they wanted to know what you knew about the problem. And they contacted you to find out your role in it, correct?
They contacted me for purposes left unspecified initially. Would you come and speak with us?
And you knew that the material, and are you telling us you don't know who it was that contacted you?
I don't remember who it was. That's what I told you.
Was it a cleric or a non-cleric?
Sorry, I don't remember.
And what was the reason you gave that person for refusing to cooperate with the Archbishop's study?
Right. So let's roll back a little bit of your question there. The Archbishop did not order me to participate. At no time has anyone indicated to me that the Archbishop was placing me under obedience to do so. So I had no such summons or legitimate exercise of obedience in my regard. I don't recall that I gave any particular reason, but I don't recall the conversation in any depth. I'm sorry.
So in any case, you do recall refusing to give the information requested, correct?
Well, once again, I believed and believe to this day that there's tons and tons and tons of information, and I think I heard the lawyers here talking before we began about the voluminous information. My belief too today is that I was likely to be asked to offer my opinion on a variety of things rather than information, because the information's well documented and filed.
But you knew it was the Archbishop's study, so what was the reason then you gave to not cooperate with the Archbishop's study?
Well, again, I don't recall giving any reason, because I don't recall the conversation.
Well, was it an email or a phone call or a letter requesting the information?
I'm almost certain it was, again, wasn't requesting information, but requesting my appearance And I believe it came in the form of a phone call.
And after you refused to give the information requested by whomever it was, delegated by the Archbishop, did the Archbishop ever contact you and say, Father McDonough, you're required to cooperate with this investigation. I empowered this investigation. I'm trying to get to the bottom of this problem, and I've convened a commission to do so, and I'm ordering you to do to answer the questions that are asked of you.
I will
So
object to the misstatement and characterization of facts and the
Or anything like that.
description.
If I
But
could
this
just
is
address-
an independent task force that was retained, but
If I could just address the first portion of what you said, and you may choose to continue, you'll do what you want to do. I don't believe I ever refused to give information. So let me start with that. I think that's a mischaracterization, Mr. Anderson. Nonetheless, to the latter part of your question, the latter part which was a question, no, Archbishop never approached me and ordered me to appear before anyone.
Well, when you say when you contend you didn't refuse to give information, you did refuse to give an interview, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you did refuse to answer any questions asked of you by those that were seeking it, right?
I don't recall that latter portion, if they ever reached out with questions or not. But I did refuse to be interviewed, that's right.
Well, an interview is questions asked and questions answered.
Sure.
And you refused to do that, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
So it was a refusal to do an interview.
Right.
Okay. What were you afraid of?
I'm not afraid of much. Let me say what I said right at the very beginning. The last several months have been characterized by a media frenzy, significant amount of it, from my perspective, generated by, among other things, misstatements of law from your own office.
But this was the Archbishop's investigation, not the media investigation, and that one being done by me.
again,
So
I
why were you
object
afraid
the
to
characterization of
give,
that.
why were you afraid then to give an interview to the Archbishop's delegate?
I do not characterize my stance as fear, but my prudent choice was in the then current environment, that my participation would add nothing not already available in the records possessed by the Archdiocese.
At some point in time, you're aware that we took the deposition of Archbishop Neinstadt a couple weeks ago?
I've heard that,
Yeah.
yes.
Have you read it, the transcript of it?
No.
Archbishop Neinstadt indicated that at some point in time a decision was made to not record some conversations between at least yourself and him because there was a concern they could be discovered in litigation. When in time, if you did, make a decision to not record some conversations with Archbishop Neinstadt concerning childhood sexual abuse and the handling of it, so that they would not be discovered in litigation.
Again, I object to the characterization of what Archbishop testified to. It's in the record, and that will stand. With that
Yeah.
objection, go ahead.
If what you've said accurately characterizes what the Archbishop said, then I'd have to be in a position to disagree with them, because to my knowledge, first of all, he and I would never have been in a position for much casual conversation. Archbishop Neinstadt managed largely by memo. And so just about any communication Archbishop Neinstadt and I have ever had probably is already available to you, especially if it's about these matters. But I don't recall a question ever being asked about recording conversations between the Archbishop and myself. So if he did in fact characterize things, Mr. Anderson, the way you've said, then I think he's wrong. But it sounds to me like that's a mischaracterization of his remarks.
Did you ever suggest to Archbishop Neinstadt that it'd be best not to document some of the conversations had between yourself and others concerning the problems of childhood sexual abuse and how they were being handled?
I believe not.
No conversation ever with him about that topic and not recording things, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
You're sure of that?
Well, I'm telling you that's my recollection at this point, yeah.
Did you yourself ever make a choice not to record certain things because you were concerned that our office would get them in litigation?
Actually, my stance usually, you probably didn't ever hear this because I didn't call you, but when I produced records, my tendency was to mentally invite Jeff Anderson into the office, presuming that I would be held accountable in the years ahead for my activity. So my general stance was to think in terms of what I was producing as one day being publicly available. And you, by the way, I offer you as a compliment, were part of the imagination I had in that regard.
Well, thank you for that compliment. When did you formulate that view that you should do that way with me in mind?
Sometime perhaps about 20 years ago.
Was there any particular instance or event that triggered that particular formulation?
Of course, you and I have had a great deal of interaction over the years,
Yeah.
and I don't recall any specific event.
Now, the charter in 2002 announced quite publicly that there would now be, if there hadn't already been, a so-called zero tolerance, correct?
That was the way it was often characterized. I don't know the charter itself said that, but nonetheless, that's an accurate public characterization.
That was certainly the public perception and the way it was promoted across the country and in this archdiocese. Zero tolerance.
I did not particularly use those words, but I recall it quite vividly, yes.
Did you believe there to have been a zero tolerance in this archdiocese before that time?
No, just as I've testified, during the 1990s, we continued to engage men, even with proven criminal histories of sexual abuse of minors, in administrative and some limited pastoral capacities. So I did not believe, no, that we had a zero tolerance stance prior to that.
Okay. And did you yourself have any participation in the Catholic Conference of Bishops that formulated the policy ultimately known as zero tolerance in 2002?
So I'm going to answer with two things. You say, I believe that the practices in the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis, which I helped, although I was not fundamentally in charge of, but I helped to formulate, informed the work of the bishops. But no, because I am not now nor ever have been a Roman Catholic bishop, I was not part of that work at all.
Were you there at the conference in Dallas?
I was, yeah.
And at that time, as an advisor to Archbishop Flynn?
I was, well, I would always was an advisor of Archbishop Flynn, of course. So, but my particular purpose to be there was our presumption that he would be involved with national media conversations and that I could be available. We had just had a turnover in communications personnel so that I could be available to local media, given the fact that he was likely to be tied up throughout the meeting with other folk. Would it be useful to take a little break?
If you want to.
I would
choose
like,
to?
if I could,
You
for
may.
just maybe
Sure.
3 minutes is all.
Oh, no, you need, take whatever you need.
Thank you.
Video record at 9:56 a.m. Back on the video record at 10:04 a.m.
Father, have you ever told any official in the Archdiocese, or staff for that matter, to not document matters pertaining to childhood sexual abuse for any reason?
No.
Have you always considered yourself a mandated reporter while a priest?
This is, of course, mandated reporter of child abuse or endangerment? Yes.
Yes.
Well, always. I think I only learned of that sometime in the first few years after ordination.
And what, as a mandated reporter, do you consider the criterion for having to make a report as required by law to be?
Okay. Perhaps I can give some history.
Well, just
Please.
what your understanding of what the criterion is for triggering a report.
Right.
What do you understand that to be?
My understanding from the law is that if we have reason to think that a young person is in danger now, which would include, my understanding, criminal activity or potentially criminal activity that's happened in the last 3 years, that we don't try to establish the veracity or not of that. We simply turn that over to the public officials.
So where did you get that last 3 years as a criterion?
That's my understanding from the law, but that's years ago since I.
Is that your interpretation of it, or an interpretation given you by somebody else?
I think I might have even seen, well, yes, actually, so you'll get the history. In about 1988 or 89, Father O'Connell and I met with the head of the sex crimes unit for St. Paul, a fellow who subsequently went on to be the sheriff in Washington County. I'm sorry, I don't remember his name. And we asked him, what do you want to know? What format do you want to know it in? How do we report to you? That was a very useful conversation and it formed our practice thereafter.
So let me interrupt you, because the question was, when did you come to that interpretation? Was that 89?
I think it was 88 or 89. Then thereafter, sometime in the first half of the 1990s, I don't recall the exact time, but my colleague then, Bill Fallon, who was chancellor, contacted the county attorneys in the 12 counties that the Archdiocese serves and asked for similar clarification, direction, instruction. Now, so I wasn't part of those calls, but I encouraged him to make them and then heard the reply back, and I believe about 7 or so of the counties gave us something similar to what I've just said to you.
So is it your belief today that a report is triggered only if there is a current danger or one that has existed in the last 3 years?
Oh, you were asking about mandated.
Yes.
Yes.
For a mandated
So
report.
for mandating, my understanding is that, yes.
What do you understand the timing to be for making such a report?
Immediately, which means, as I understand it, within 24 hours.
Have you ever not made such a report?
When I was mandated to do so, I have never not made such a report. I'll put it positively. I've been aware of my responsibility as a mandated reporter and have always followed through on that responsibility. I've also advised as many people as I've had the opportunity to do so to do the same thing.
Have you ever advocated for the continuation of any priest in ministry whom you have known to have had histories of sexual molestation of minors? Yes or no?
Well, I'm going to give you a longer answer than yes or no. When the Archbishop would ask me under the previous policy about whether he ought to, what kind of assignment he ought to give to a fellow, I did provide advice at various times about the kind of policy, the kind of assignment that be consistent with the policy Archbishop Roach had approved. So yes, I did. I wouldn't call that advocate, but rather I responded to my Archbishop's request for perspective.
In connection with what priest and what Archbishop?
Again, this would be primarily with Archbishop Roach. I don't recall that it ever happened with Archbishop Flynn.
And do you recall what priest?
Do you know, I don't. I do recall one, Jerome Kern.
Did you advocate his removal from ministry or his continuation in ministry?
I eventually advocated his removal from ministry in 2002. Some handful of years before then, I suggested when Archbishop Roach, I believe, wanted to move him from a pastor position to an associate pastor position, the conditions under which the Archbishop ought to do that.
I took the deposition of Jerome Kern yesterday. Are you aware of that?
I am.
Yeah. What documents did you review in preparation for this deposition today?
Didn't review any documents to help my memory of this.
Have you reviewed anything in preparation for this deposition?
Other than
You don't have to answer that. He's answered the question.
Yeah.
Well,
He told you that he didn't review anything to refresh his memory, which is what he's obligated to disclose.
well, the question is in preparation for this deposition, what have you reviewed?
I spent time in prayer. That's it.
Have you spoken with any of your fellow priests or any officials from the Archdiocese about it, or what you're expected to be asked?
No.
Would you say what it is, please?
Yes.
The deposition.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I have not spoken with fellow priests or with Archdiocesan officials in anticipation of this deposition. Oops.
When you make mention of Jerome Kern, it's correct that he was removed or allowed to resign or retire in 2002 from active ministry, correct?
Yes.
And did you advocate for that at that time or
I did.
against it?
I advocated for his removal, resignation, retirement.
You did not advocate for his removal from ministry before that, however, did you?
I did advocate for his restriction in ministry. I don't recall that I advocated specifically that he be permanently removed.
There is no record of him having been restricted in his ministry before 2002, is there?
I don't have access to the records, but I would be surprised that if there were no such record.
Do you recall that in 1987, Al-Mashad made an appointment with you and reported to you that he had been sexually abused by Jerome Kern? Specifically, Kern had been with him at the seminary and put his hand in his genitals.
I don't recall the specific year, but I do recall listening to Al. Yes.
And you recall meeting with him in your office where you had the Kern file in front of you and reviewed some of the material with Al Mashad, telling him some about Kern's history?
I don't recall that, but sounds like what I would have done.
Okay. He reports, and the file reflects that there were reports that Kern had abused in 1969 made by two parents when Kern was at St. Mark's. And that was reflected in the file. Are you aware of that?
I'm going to just dispute one word that you used, and that's the word abuse. And in fact, what I do recall, and this is now from memory, I've not had a chance to review documents or files, so there's probably much more material about it. But what I recall is that while clearly Kern's behavior with these young people, and my recollection is the Al Mashad behavior was very similar to the 60s, late 60s report, that it was disturbing enough for people to call it out. That a question at the time was, did that in fact constitute child abuse? Now, it's years later, and I think we all have greater clarity about those things. The question at the time, as I recall, Jerome Kern characterized this as wrestling, like what he had done with his siblings. So when my predecessor, Father O'Connell, in the late 1980s, rediscovered the 1960s information, my recollection is that he asked a local Twin Cities expert, Gary Schoner, to review the behavior and help us understand how credible was Kern's denial that this constituted abuse, but rather was roughhousing or play.
So did you believe Kern when he claimed it was roughhousing?
You know, I don't know that I believed it particularly. My concern was to understand it.
You also knew that offenders of childhood sexual abuse deny, minimize, and blame, correct? You knew
Yes.
that?
Yes.
You've long known that.
I've
'cause
long
you've dealt
known
with a
that.
lot of them.
Yes.
Right.
So again, when Al
And so
came-
did you see Kern's description of roughhousing or wrestling with these kids as reported by him to be a denial of sexual abuse?
Yes, I did see his report as a denial.
And so you believed him?
I did not.
Okay, did you believe he had committed sexual abuse then?
I was not sure how to characterize. So when Al came to see me, when Mr. Mashad came to see me, I sent the additional information to Gary Schoner to ask Gary once again, look at, here's another story like the one from that point perhaps 25 years ago. This one goes back at this point nearly, well, 15 years. How do we characterize this today?
Did you send to Gary Schoner what Al Mashad had reported to you Kern had done to him or not? Do you know?
I think the file will establish what's there, but I believe I did, yes.
Okay, but you don't know that as you speak.
Recall it, yes.
In the file, you recorded that Al Mashad reported to you, and I quote, he was grabbed by the crotch, the kid was aroused, and Kern reached inside the bathing suit after the kid was aroused. That's sexual abuse, isn't it?
I certainly would report that to the police today.
You didn't report it then, did you?
I did not. Wasn't consistent with what I understood to be the matters that public officials had told us they wanted to hear, so.
So in '87, are you telling us that that is not something the public officials wanted to know about a priest having done to a kid?
In 1987, I was not part of that, or 1988 or whatever, that was Father O'Connell. But yes, after our consultations with the sex crimes person here and with the county attorneys took place at about this time, probably somewhat before, I had the understanding that they did not want to know about older matters. I'm certainly aware, I've heard now, that they'd like to know about older matters. But the instructions under which I was operating from the public officials was, we can't do anything with that, we don't want to know about it.
Do you recall telling Al Mashad after reviewing the file with him and hearing his report, January 90, excuse me, after hearing his report, that you promised him you'd get back to him and never did?
Because that's a compound question. I think, do I recall that I promised to get back
Yes.
to him? Did I promise I never did? Or do I recall that I never did? I don't recall promising to get back to him, although I presume I would. And I do recall that there was subsequent interaction with him. So I think it's inaccurate to say that I never got back to him.
Did you weep during the meeting with Al Mashad about the history that you saw reflected in the file and what he reported to you?
I don't recall that specifically.
Have you ever wept hearing the reports of victims like him?
Rather seldom. I didn't want to mislead people with false displays of emotion, so my approach would generally be fairly sober.
Did you demonstrate to him in that meeting that you were upset about what you learned from the file, having reviewed it with him?
I don't recall that, Mr. Anderson.
The records do reflect that in August of 1993, I misspoke on a date, Father McDonough. The meeting with Mashad was in 1987. I said 87, I think.
Thank you, and I think I responded suggesting it was a little later.
Okay,
so I think
so
we're on.
that was my mistake. I want to correct it. The records reflect that he actually met with you on January 22nd, 1993, and made the report.
Thank you.
Okay. My apologies for that. The records also reflect that same year in August, Al Mashad, unhappy about the response, or lack thereof as he reported it, hired us, and I brought suit. And that was public. You recall that?
Actually, had you asked me if you had been involved in the suit, I honestly would have forgotten that. But I do recall that Al wasn't happy, Mr. Mashad was unhappy, and that there was a suit. I had forgotten that you represented him.
And at that time, Kern was still in ministry, unrestricted, correct?
That's correct.
And at that time, do you recall drafting a letter for Archbishop Roach to be read to the parishioners at Immaculate Heart of Mary, where he was then the pastor?
I think you may have some things out of sequence there, because I believe this is my memory of it. Again, the files will establish it. But after we'd consulted with Gary Schoner, Archbishop then directed that Kern should remain in ministry, but Archbishop Roach said, we need to talk to the people in the parish and let them know what's going on. So, and I'll tell you the factoid that has this burned in my memory. I went out for a meeting, several hundred parishioners were there. We said, here's our assessment, but you need to understand that there have been these complaints. We're told by experts that they don't constitute child abuse, that he's not a danger today, but we want you, abundance of caution, we want you to know about this. Now here's the factoid that has why I think your timing is incorrectly stated, is that I believe that the very next day, the meeting was on a Sunday, as I recall, and that someone who'd been at the meeting went to his workplace and said something stupid like, there was a meeting at my church and some crazy person is accusing our nice priest, and the the coworker he was talking to was Mr. Mashad.
In any case, it was reported to the parishioners that Kern had been assessed, and it was also reported by Archbishop Roach, and I think a letter prepared by you, that Kern had denied it and gave the impression that Kern was innocent of having committed sexual abuse against Al Mashad or any of the kids, correct?
I don't think you're characterizing anything differently than I've already said, so I think just hold that up to what I've said.
And are you aware that the parishioners then rallied around Father Kern, believing that he had been assessed and determined to have been safe?
Actually, my recollection is, but this is a long time ago now, this is 20-some years ago, my recollection is that there was a rather robust debate among folks in the parish about whether he's trustworthy, ought they to trust him. And in fact, for some time he was assigned in a team ministry with another very well thought of priest named Father Custodio. And my recollection is that either Father Custodio or one of the trustees reported there was some serious questioning about whether he ought to remain among the people. So
he was ultimately allowed to continue in ministry, and there was consideration of several options, and one of those was to make him an administrator versus a pastor, so that he could be removed quickly if there was any further public disclosure. Do you recall that?
I think you're conflating a couple of things. That the appointment as administrator permits the Archbishop to remove a pastor without due process. That part I acknowledge. The notion that it was further public disclosure that would trigger that, I don't recall that was the issue. This of course was all very, very broadly reported in the media at the time. So I don't think there was, and in fact, well, I'll stop there and you can ask.
Let's talk about the public disclosure then made to the parishioners. It is correct that no public disclosure was made to the parishioners at that time, that there had been earlier complaints concerning Kern as reflected in the file, other than the one being discussed made by Al Mashad, correct?
I'm almost certain that's not true.
Okay. Did you draft the letter for Archbishop Roach where he states, "I do not believe Kern abused anyone," unquote?
I don't recall whether I drafted that or not.
Is your position today that either the file or the history known to you at any time concerning Kern was that there was never anything that reflected actual sexual abuse by him of any minor?
I think I already said, and I'll say it again, I would characterize today his actions as abuse. I'm not informed enough about the law to say whether he would have been prosecuted at the time or not, but I certainly would say that's absolutely unacceptable for a priest. But my understanding through the 1990s was that Kern was representing his activity as a family pattern of roughhousing, and that Gary Schoner's opinion was that that was consistent with the man's then current psychological functioning.
Is it also your understanding that you and Archbishop Roach were choosing to believe Kern's account of the events versus the hut makers, who had reported in '69, and Mashad, who had made a later report?
No. Oh, that's not my understanding.
You did know that even by Kern's account, he had placed his hands on the genitals of al-Mashad.
Do you know, I don't recall those details at this point. I'm sorry.
Your understanding of mandatory reporting, had that been either recorded or heard by you, would have required a report, correct? Or not?
At any time during this relevant period, had Mr. Mashad or someone else come in and said that this had happened to him recently, I would have got out of the room and called the police myself. This was by that point, a matter that was some 15 or so years previous.
What priests, other than Freddie Montero, have you, I think you reported Montero, didn't you?
I did,
okay.
Yes.
Other than Montero, who have you reported to law enforcement directly?
Right. Let me just back up and
as
say,
a mandated reporter.
Let me say that I'm not sure that I made the call myself. I may have, or I may have walked down the hall because I was talking with the mother of this unfortunate child, and so I may have asked the chancellor at the time, either Bill Fallon or Andy Eisenberg, I can't recall, to make the call. But
so
because I
let
didn't
me
leave
just
the
state
mother
the
alone.
question.
Yes.
Other than Montero,
yeah.
if you made a report on Montero, but let's
Yeah.
not quibble over that.
Yeah.
But let's get an answer to this question. What priests have you personally reported to law enforcement
Yeah.
for suspicions of childhood sexual abuse as required by statute?
Right.
Just give me the names,
Right.
if any.
You know, I'm not recalling right now whom. I believe I did in a couple of cases, but I don't recall right now.
What priests, if any, have you instructed somebody else to make a mandated report on your behalf?
You know, I am recalling.
If
I am recalling. Now, there's a priest by the name of Mark Wayman, W-E-H-M-A-N, or two N's, I'm not sure. And in one case, I believe I called the South St. Paul police myself. And in a second matter, I then I got a word from one of our education staffers that the principal of the school where he was assigned had expressed concern, and I said, don't call us, call the police.
Okay. Now,
So
my
that's
question was restricted to either you reporting
Right.
or you instructing somebody else to
Right.
make the mandated report.
Right. So I
And
think.
so if I'm hearing your answer correct, you're saying in connection with Mark Wayman, you instructed somebody to make a report? Is that what your testimony is?
I think my testimony is two things. I made one report, and then the second, I didn't have the information directly, so I instructed the other mandated reporter to communicate that directly to the police,
Okay.
which in fact happened.
So you made the report in the case of whom?
Of Wayman.
And you instructed, and the other one you're referring to is whom?
Is Wayman.
Okay. So both reports are in connection with Wayman.
That's right.
Okay. Any others?
In regard to this,
Where you
right.
instructed somebody to make the mandated report?
You know, I'm not recalling right now, but I'm sure my memory will refresh.
when did you first compile lists of priests who were accused of abuse, credibly or otherwise?
My general practice was not to compile lists.
Okay.
So
when did you first compile a list, if you ever did?
I think what I've just said is responsive. I don't think that I ever compiled lists. And that you is addressed to me in the singular, I presume. Is that right?
Well, you or others working with you. I mean, when were lists begun to be compiled?
Okay. It's a little different question.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the first time there was an attempt to sit down and really list all of these was in regard to the John Jay study in 2002 or 2003. And do you want to talk about this?
Well, we'll get to that. If it's 2002 or 2003, I'm going to ask you about something earlier. First, why didn't you, as the guy most in charge, at least as Vicar General, for handling sexual abuse issues, compile such a list?
Let me deal briefly with the assertion in the beginning of that, and then I will respond directly to the question.
If I was mistaken, you're not the guy in charge
No.
of handling sexual abuse?
I was not the one most in charge. A number of us worked together in a team under the Archbishop's direction.
Okay.
So the Archbishop's in charge.
Okay.
That being said, why did I not do this work? Because it was a matter of going through the records, and so I turned to the Chancellor, who is the chief record officer of the Archdiocese, and said,
Got it.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to the Exhibit 102 that we referred to earlier, which was the 1998 article where you're quoted. And I'll just read a part of it because I'm going to ask you a question. On the first page of it, it says...
Wait a second.
Could I ask you to hold just a second till
Sure.
I find it again? Yeah. Okay, I'm there now.
And in the first page, in the last paragraph, it is written, for the first time, McDonough revealed the extent of the problem in an interview this week. Period. 15 priests in the Archdiocese have been, quote, credibly accused, unquote, of molesting minors during the past 50 years, McDonough said. So how did you get the number 15 in 1998 if a list had not been made?
I was regularly accessing the files, and so I think that was my own memory from accessing the file.
You go on to state, and I'll read it, the number is higher than the national average, McDonough said, but corresponds to experts' predictions. When you say that number is higher than the national average, what are you relying upon here as your baseline for that assertion?
And in regard to the national average, or in regard to the characterization of the local number? I'm not sure what you're asking me there, Mr. Anderson.
Well, when you're saying that it's higher than the national average, what do you mean?
Right.
And on what do you base that
Right.
at that time?
Through the 1980s and 90s, actually into the 2000s, I and my colleagues regularly participated in a variety of regional, national trainings, forums, and so on. And so somewhere along the line, perhaps even from the print media, I learned that prediction. Now, I don't recall specifically where I got it from because I was, as were my colleagues, regularly participating in a variety of trainings and seminars and following literature.
To your knowledge, do the archbishops here or the bishops across the country, in your meetings with them, ever make an effort to compile lists before the efforts made and reported widely in 2002?
Not to my knowledge.
So is it your
And could
testimony?
I also, well, just while it's on the table, I'm not sure it's implicit, so I don't want to let it get past, that the effort in 2002 was an effort to compile a list, and I think that's inaccurate. It's been an issue, Mr. Anderson, I've had with you for some time, although again in my own head. There was no attempt even then to compile a list. There was a survey to understand the extent of a problem, but not the compiling of a list.
So when did you first see a list?
I'm sorry, what kind of a list?
Of a priest accused or credibly accused of abusing minors
Right.
in the Archdiocese?
Probably so I was seeing the files regularly, perhaps most every day.
So the question is when?
Yes, throughout the time I worked at the Archdiocese, I saw the files. That was not a list,
Yeah.
but I saw the files which had names on them. Okay.
When did you see a list?
And in making his report to the John Jay study, I have a vague recollection that Bill Fallon checked with me to see that we were not missing anybody from the list, or the numbers he was submitting, not a list, but the numbers. And it was in that context that I would have seen whatever compilation he had done.
And when is that?
That would, I don't recall if it was 2002 or 2003.
You told NPR that the Archdiocese didn't have a list of abusers. Was that correct when you told them that?
Yes.
Why wouldn't and why didn't the Archdiocese keep such a list and track who they knew to have been accused of, credibly or otherwise, of abuse before 2003?
So there's two parts to your question. We're talking here about the specific mechanics of a list. We had active files that were regularly accessed by all those who had responsibilities in these areas. So there was no need to compile a list because the information was immediately available.
Yeah, but who has access to all those files? And those files are extremely voluminous. My question is knowing that there are voluminous files, and you say we had access, that doesn't mean a lot of people, right? It just means the Archbishop and his delegates. So my question to you is, why didn't the Archdiocese before 2003 make a conscious decision to determine who those were that had been accused, credibly and otherwise, so that you could know and it could be shared with others that needed to know?
Right. Well, for the latter portion of that, again, my belief then and to today is that that information was widely dispersed among those who had the need to know. And I'll mention that briefly. The files were kept on the main floor of the Archdiocesan office, easily accessible through my secretary or administrative assistant. And in the working files of the individual priests, a card was inserted which indicated there's other information kept under lock and key. See so-and-so to get access to them. So that's in terms of access to the information. I was concerned, I'm guessing the last few months probably convinced reasonable people that this is so. You're talking to a judge about it. Lists just with names on them are notoriously difficult to make accurate, and they imply clarity of information where clarity of information is not existent. I indicated, for example, and I regret this now, of course, looking back, but during the 1990s, we didn't consider Jerome Kern to have actually abused children. Again, I regret that, but I don't think Jerome Kern's name would have shown up on a list had we made a list. So,
Well, if it had been recorded in a file by you or others that he had put his hands upon the genitals of Al Mashad and or similar reports have been made by others, it should have been, correct?
That's certainly my opinion today. Once again, the expert advice we were receiving independent, as I recall, a litigation witness for you, was that these matters that were reported about Kern did not constitute sexual abuse of a minor.
For the John Jay study, didn't you or Fallon have to write the names down and find the actual number?
I'm sure that's so, yes.
You make mention of the files. Let me ask you about that. You say these files are readily available to those that need to know. Is that what you said?
I believe that is. We can check the record if you'd like, but it sounds like what I said.
Who are those that need to know about what's in those files?
Well, of course, you're asking the present tense, and so today I'm not in a position to say that. It's been some years since I've been in a position to say that. You want to talk about the past?
Well, let's talk about the files.
Yeah.
First, who needed to know when you were Vicar General what was in those files?
Right. The normal access would have been to the Archbishop, any of the assistant bishops, and there were differing numbers at various times, the chancellors, or anyone they would designate, and there were, I think throughout all the time I was Vicar General, no, for 1 year there was one chancellor, but otherwise there were two. Priest personnel director, or later the clergy personnel director. Communications, any of the folks working with priest benefit matters, the chief financial officer. There may be a few others, but those are the ones I can think of right now.
When you mentioned a priest benefit officer and a CFO, is that because they needed to know because extra payments, there has been a practice of making extra payments to known offenders in the Archdiocese?
I certainly wouldn't characterize our practice that way. If you'd like, I'll characterize it the way I would, but I don't agree with you in the characterization.
Well, Capone was receiving extra payments, wasn't he?
Capone was receiving transitional assistance.
And he's not the only that was receiving extra payments who was known to have been an offender, was he?
I'm disputing your characterization of extra payments. I will stand by my characterization of transitional assistance, and it is correct, as you assert, however, that Capone is not the only one.
And how many accused or known offenders were receiving additional funds beyond the ordinary provided a priest?
Right.
How many?
I don't know the number. Any priest who was removed under the Charter for the Protection of Children and Youth received some sort of transitional assistance. Beyond that, it had been our practice for many years that any priest leaving the priesthood for just about any reason whatsoever received transitional assistance. So fellows who were leaving, priests who were leaving because of psychological disability, depression, alcoholism, we would assist them as well in making their transition.
Were you aware, Father, that there's a separate account kept at the Archdiocese where payments are being made to offenders and accused offenders for additional assistance?
For transitional assistance, yes, I was. I
it's
think
a 515 account, you recall that?
Might be 1515.
1515.
I believe we did that at the direction of the Finance Council so that they would know what the activities were.
And that was a practice begun in what year?
I believe in the context of the Charter, but I don't recall that specifically. We may have accounted for it separately before that.
Was that discussed in Finance Council minutes?
I don't recall if it appeared in minutes or not.
Was it discussed in Finance Council?
I'm guessing it probably was. I don't recall that specific.
Do you have actual knowledge that beyond yourself, the Archbishop, the auditor, and the CFO, anybody else knew that such payments were being made to these known offenders?
Yes. Well, I shouldn't say actual knowledge. I can speak to the likelihood, but I don't have actual knowledge.
Let's go back to the files for a moment. Okay. When you talk about the files that people that needed to know had access to, and you've identified those, what files are you talking about when you said that the Archbishop and all these other people you identified had access to concerning the offenders?
The files I would have characterized then, I believe, I certainly characterize today, as files about disciplinary matters.
Okay, now, name the files, though, that you're talking about. What do you call those files?
I call them the disciplinary files.
And in your discussions with your colleagues who have knowledge of these files, is that what you called them when you referred to them? Because we need a name here.
Right. Well, I'm calling them disciplinary files. I don't recall what, I've heard some people refer to them some years ago as restricted files.
Well, there are priest files that are the ordinary personnel matters that pertain to assignments and any, all matters pertaining to where they are and what they're doing and all that kind of stuff. Those are maintained, are they not?
They were during my time, yes.
And they're called like just priest files. Is that correct?
That would be the term of art, I presume, something like that.
And you're referring to another category of files called disciplinary files, correct?
That's correct.
And the disciplinary files contain what?
Okay, so again, recognize you're talking in the present tense. I've not worked in these matters with any authority since 2008.
Well, let's talk about if you have. Well, you were the delegate for safety in 2008. You'd accessed the files since then, haven't you? I mean, that's your role.
Actually, generally, I did not make access. Whether I had access or not, I don't know. My fundamental responsibility after June 15th of 2008 was the prevention programs. So I probably did have access. I don't recall that I ever attempted to access after 2008.
Well, as a delegate for safe environment by the Archbishop in 2008, and for the years that you were, doesn't it seem important to know about what has happened in the past as reflected in files to know what to do to prevent it in the future? I mean,
of course, most of my work was in regard to our educational efforts.
monitoring?
Well, hold on a second. 80,000 or so kids each year receiving safe environment training, to the work of publicizing our activities within church and letting people know.
Okay, so
and also
let
monitoring.
me just, I don't want to be rude, but I have limited time, so I don't want to, I need you. So you didn't go back to the files after 2008, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. So the disciplinary files contain what?
They would include whatever reports we'd made and were made to us, Archdiocesan officials, and then what we did about those reports. They might include press clippings and a variety of other things as well. Everything relevant to the complaint about disciplinary problems.
And where would anything that would be deemed to be scandalous under canon law be maintained?
I don't know that there's a particular determination under canon law of scandal.
Well, 489, Section 489 of the Code talks about the maintenance of archives for
Okay.
scandalous materials, does it not?
I don't recall the specific use of that term, but you're probably referring to the canons, which would be in the 300s somewhere, about a secret archives.
Yes. So are the secret archives a part of the disciplinary file or separate?
I don't believe the Archdiocese has maintained, at least when I was Chancellor, we did not maintain. When I was Vicar General, we did not maintain secret archives.
So the files that you said that those that needed to know would be the disciplinary files that you're referring to?
Correct.
Any other files?
There are probably multiple files on priests. There's the main files in the vault, which include a reference to this other. The priest.
My interest, of course, are the files pertaining to priests who offend kids. So you know what we're talking about.
All right,
here.
good.
I'm not talking about other matters. We're
Their
talking
pension
about
matters and
child
that sort of thing.
safety, child protection, prevention, and or failure to do so. So when it comes to kids and priests abusing kids, and the files maintained by the Archdiocese, you say there are disciplinary files apart from the priest file, correct?
Correct.
And they're maintained by whom?
Well, again, past tense now, because I haven't been involved with that since 2008. They were maintained by the Chancellor's office and by me, mostly by my administrative assistant, Judy Delaney. The file, but let me go to your specific question about child abuse
Okay,
matters.
first, two different
Yes.
locations are you talking about then? The Chancellor's office and by you?
No, you said by whom. So yes, two different group of people would
Okay.
send materials there maintained.
Okay.
The,
Now, just a minute. I gotta get this file understood. So we're talking about the same thing.
yes.
There are files in the Chancellor's office, right?
Their files in what's in common chancery practice referred to as the vault.
The vault.
The vault, and the vault is, if you will, owned, and I'm putting that between quotation marks, owned by the Chancellor's Department.
Okay. And basically, under canon law, the vault, isn't it just the Archbishop and his designee have access to the vault?
Those folks do, and pretty much all the staff working there would have access as they needed.
Is there a file or files maintained that are designated secret?
Not during my time. I can't say what's happened in the last 6 years.
Were there files maintained designated restricted?
These are the ones I call disciplinary. Some might have referred to them as restricted.
And they are restricted to whose eyes?
You know, that's
Those you named, or more
basically
limited?
those I named. But again, restricted is less a matter of who can see them. It's simply that to have access to them, one would have to go through another person. So one would not access them all by him or herself. That's the restriction's not so much about who, it's simply about how, in my time. It's a nice tie, by the way.
Where were the disciplinary files kept?
I don't have a specific memory for all of the years, but largely during the majority of the time that I was there, they were kept in my secretary or my administrative assistant's office.
That's Judy Delaney?
Judy Delaney, yes.
And were there files that were restricted pertaining to sexual abuse kept any place else?
Probably two other places not restricted. One is that some of that material remained in the general file of a priest. And then when priest died, sometime in the year or two after his death, his file would be transferred to what was often referred to as the downstairs vault. It was simply a locked archives room in the basement. And so those files also would have materials related to a priest.
Only those that were deceased. Is that your belief?
That was the practice in my time.
Did Archbishop Flynn maintain separate files in a fireproof closet or cabinet?
Not to my knowledge.
Did you keep files on your own it someplace?
I often had working files, and I tried with some regularity then to clean those and send the material to the vault or to the Chancellor's Department for their assignment.
Did you keep files that you did not share with others or direct into either the vault or the disciplinary file?
No.
Did you have the practice of taking notes of various reports and then destroying the notes?
My practice was to not maintain loose paper floating around. That's what you mean. The very extensive Archdiocesan files, because I'd been their supervisor for a number of years, I'd come to recognize there was a very extensive documentation, a lot of which I think you've shared over the years.
Were the disciplinary files kept under lock and key?
They were.
And who had key?
The key was kept in the top middle drawer of Judy Delaney's desk.
And who knew it was there?
All of the people I've just mentioned. And their secretaries.
Before 2008, did you use email?
Very, very little.
Why not?
I didn't consider myself competent. I had very extensive secretarial support, but that began to change in the last 18 months or so that I was Vicar General. We went through a very significant staff downsizing. And so I believe it was in the context of that downsizing, sometime in 2007 or 2008, that I learned to use email.
Are there any other files pertaining to childhood sexual abuse and priests and records of that maintained by the Archdiocese, to your knowledge, that you have not identified either by name or location?
Again, given that I don't know what the current practice is, I have to direct answer to your question is no.
What about electronic files? How then are they stored and kept?
That practice, the issue of electronic filing was very, very nascent when I was Chief of Staff, and I don't recall that any determination was made about that at the time.
Was it, at some point in time, did you stop keeping electronic copies or printed copies of emails because you were concerned about them being discovered?
Oh, okay, so let me say, underlying fact, I don't recall ever keeping paper copies of emails.
Would you have Judy print them out?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you direct that they be put someplace?
I'd use them as needed and either destroy them or send them to the file.
And did you at some point express the view that you chose to destroy some of those because you believe they could be or may be discovered in litigation?
I don't believe I did, no.
Did anyone ever tell you that they were going to do that or you should do that?
I don't recall that. I don't recall anyone ever telling me that. I do have a recollection from a friend in the 1980s who told me never destroy records from a file because records archaeologists can reconstruct them. And that became, for me, a kind of an operating principle from 1987 or 8 on, that it was better to have as full a file as possible.
Any other files? When you developed the Archdiocese developed a monitoring program, have there been files that were developed specific to it?
Do you know, I don't
Yes
know.
or no?
I don't know that. Yeah.
You were in charge of the monitoring program, weren't you?
I was supervised the fellows, yes.
Okay, and you have been the supervisor or had been the supervisor for how many years?
From the initiation of the program, I began in 2004 or 5 until last September. That is September of 2013.
And in 2013, what happened that caused you not to have the responsibilities concerning childhood sexual abuse you had for so many years before?
I'm grateful to say that finally Archbishop Nienstedt followed through on his promise that he would find a replacement for me.
Did you ask for out of this whole thing because of the pressures?
You know, not particularly, because when I stepped down as Vicar General, which happens always at the change of an administration, Archbishop Nienstedt, asked me to stay on as his Vicar General for a very short period of time. He'd already determined who the new Vicar General would be. He also asked that I would assist the Archdiocese with the safe environment matters until he would name a successor. From time to time, I checked with my colleagues to see how we were doing on getting me a successor. But my concern was not primarily volume.
Were files kept on those priests that were being monitored? Yes or no?
I don't know what the practice was.
Going back to, did you keep any?
No. Correction. I may have kept notes when I had a meeting to make sure I followed up. I don't think I kept those sorts of things in a file. When I would send recommendations to Archbishop Nienstedt in the last few years, I sometimes kept files, no consistent pattern in that regard.
Did you yourself keep any documents, files, or records pertaining to sexual abuse apart from those maintained by your secretary, Judy Delaney?
No.
Or her successor was Patty, wasn't it?
No, her assistant was Patty.
Assistant was Patty.
I was fortunate to have 2 assistants. Those were the days.
So you kept nothing yourself?
That's correct.
Okay. The payments to the priests accused of sexual abuse, I think the account that included that was 1-515. Does that sound right?
In my mind, I have 2 accounts, 1515 and 1516.
One was for childhood sexual abuse, and one was for adult exploitation.
Adult exploitation and other behavioral issues.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the childhood sexual abuse account. You're aware that they were paid extra and monies out of this account, and these were priests identified as having sexually abused kids, correct?
There's a lot of things mixed up in your question. I will say this. We set up the account because we were being asked to let the Finance Council and from time to time the general public know what we were spending on these problems. So the 15, whichever one it was, and I can't remember which one was 1515, which one was 1516. What we tried to do is include in there all transitional help to these fellows, I believe, payments for counseling for victims or other pastoral care for victims, probably legal settlements, although that may have been elsewhere. I don't know that portion of it. But what we were trying to do is to provide as full an accounting as possible of the financial costs of our dealing responsibly with clergy's sexual misconduct with minors. The parallel account was for all the other special assistants to priests, some of whom had offense histories of one sort or another, stole money, for example, others of whom simply were psychologically incapable of continuing their work.
And how many accused offenders are receiving these payments out of this account, offenders of childhood sexual abuse?
Do you have a specific time in mind? I don't know what the current practice is.
At the time that you were involved in these accounts being maintained and payments made.
Right. Early on, 2002 or 3, in the implementation of the charter, I would be surprised if any of the priests we'd identified, or by then former priests we'd identified, was not receiving help. That was part of the process we used, was transition. Now, those transitional payments were to have ceased at various timing with different priests. Of course, you may have heard, and this after my time, but we discovered that one of our employees at the Archdiocese was stealing funds.
That was the auditor, right?
I think he was the controller.
Okay.
Was stealing the funds.
Did you have discussions with him about these accounts and concerns raised by him about whether the fact that these offenders were being paid?
Never did, which surprised me because he claimed that. Let me just, if I could just finish the thought I was on, Mr.
Well,
Anderson.
I guess the answer to the last question was you didn't have any discussions with him about that?
That's correct.
Okay.
I would just finish up this.
Well,
I'm
which
under
question are you answering?
I'm the last one before that,
What-
about payments. You
okay.
asked about during the time I was responsible.
Okay, how many, the question was, how many were
How
being paid?
many? Yes. So, as I say, initially in 2002 or 2003, probably everybody. I don't know the exact number at this point, probably everybody. Those payments were to have diminished, and then the fellow would either become self-supporting or be paid from his accrued retirement benefits. Somewhere along the line, and I believe our felonious thief may have been involved with this, some of my agreements with these priests and former priests appear to have been countermanded. But I have that third party. I don't have that directly myself. So I don't know how many were paid. My guess is more than I authorized.
What do you mean by that counter, what did you say,
Countermanded.
Countermanded, what do you mean?
That my suspicion is, it's a suspicion, that someone in the finance office continued payments, charging them to those accounts, but may or may not have been paying them to the individual men. This is purely my suspicion. So I can't give you an accurate number, summary, conclusion of my answer to you.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and press the notification bell. Additionally, you can view our playlists and most recent videos. Thank you for watching.